And then I've got one final announcement before we turn to the review. Chip and Ellen. Ellen continues to climb up the Paul Harris flagpole. She gets another award today.
Oh, wow.
I think she's invested about $20,000 in Paul Harris. Thank you very much. Congratulations. It's all yours.
All right. Well, I'm Chip White. I spent too long in the academic womb before finally going out to the industry. And I spent 15 years flying, working in propulsion technology. And I got talked into going to the FAA, where I spent the next 16 years trying to bring industry experience into the government. And finally decided it's time to retire and finally got to come back home. So I'm going to talk about aircraft engines here today. And for me, it's the most interesting part of an airplane. Pretty sensitive mouse today. Why do we have propulsion? Well, there's four main forces that act on an airplane, and the things that kept people from flying in the early days was they didn't have enough power to get off the ground. They knew they had weight in whatever vehicle they were trying to fly. They understood they needed to get lift, but that was kind of a mystery for a lot of them up until people started generating some small wind tunnels and testing. Drag kind of was an after discovery accident, but then thrust was what created a lot of trouble. Now the Wright brothers, they needed an engine, and they figured out for their little flyer, they needed at least 10 or 11 horsepower, and it had to be under 200 pounds. They ended up building their own engine. The thing only produced 12 horsepower. Your lawnmower has more power than that today. And the engine weighed 180 pounds. So you think about it, it's not much horsepower per pound, but they managed to fly, and they demonstrated that it was feasible. By the 30s, we kind of had the high end of what happened with reciprocating engines that were water-cooled. And that was the Rolls-Royce Merlin. There were similar engines in other countries, but the Merlin was kind of a gold standard. Along the way, it was realized that that radiator and all that tubing to carry fluids and whatnot was a maintenance nuisance. They always leaked. Most of us are all old enough that we understood that driving down the road, you routinely saw a car on the side of the road boiling over, broken radiator hose, failed water pump. Well, that was a problem for aviation too. And when you're flying over the woods or over the mountain and your water pump goes, there isn't a whole lot of place to put down. So by switching to an air-cooled engine, they got rid of a lot of reasons for unintended forced landings. When they started to look at how you build an air-cooled engine, they realized if we put all the cylinders in a circle around the gearbox, you can then have them all air-cooled. And then they realized if we stack multiple rows of these engines, you can end up creating what became the high end of the Wasp series. And it was still weight and horsepower limited. People were dreaming about gas turbines, and a lot of people understood the idea that you could have, see, am I getting up on the screen here? Oh, there it goes. There's a little delay. That's right, we're on Zoom.
Could you turn your microphone on? I'm not sure if this one is picking up.
Let's see.
I can also just give you a plug for it. You want to run up to the laptop?
You what?
All right, is that working? There's always something. Okay, do we have audio? Or is that
thing glowing on your end?
Yeah, I had the audio on there.
Okay.
So I'm okay. All right. So from early on, you can go back to Archimedes and such. The idea of the turbine was out there, but nobody had a way to make it work. A lot of it was metallurgy. A lot of it was how do you control the burn, keep the compressor and the turbine working together. And by the 30s, they started to come up with some demonstrator engines that actually began to work. By the time you hit World War II, the Germans, the English, they had some flying test beds that were working, but the fuel burn was so bad that they couldn't keep the airplane in the air long enough. If you knew the enemy was coming and you could launch that jet, you had a few minutes to get up, terrorize them, but then you've got to get back on the ground. So with a little more time after World War II, people started to realize what they had to do to try to make the engine more efficient. And the very first really efficient turbine engines were turboprops. They knew how to design propellers, and they knew how to build a gearbox to take that fast turning turbine and drive a slower propeller. Within a few years, they figured out that they could build a ducted fan. Now, by a ducted fan, let's see, does my
It's an issue on this computer. Everyone on Zoom still sees you. It's
Oh,
pop up.
okay, so you all then are are losing here. Is it something you can get back up or?
Take a second, but let's.
Bobby, can you hear me? Raise your hand if you can. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Could you pass that?
Thank you.
Let's see. Where did that go? Technology, it's the death of us. Yeah, this is why for the longest amount of time in commercial aircraft, people didn't want to go to electronic cockpits. They were thinking about the blue screen of death when you're trying to come in on final approach. Like steam gauges, cable controls and whatnot.
You see your pilot coming in for landing down and said, hey, who bought the HDMI cable?
That's right. Let's see, do I have to hit F8 or something to? No, we'll get that next. Yeah. Ooh. Now, are we on Zoom or are we on the cable?
We're on your machine.
All right.
If your
One
screen-
way or another, it's working.
If your screen is either mirroring or if your screen went black, it's just showing here.
No, I must be mirrored because
Okay.
normally I have to hit F8 and then jump over to pick dual display, but I guess this machine is smarter than my old laptop. So then they figured out the low bypass turbine. Now, by that, what I mean is there is a certain amount of the fan air that blows around the core and a certain amount that goes through the core. The core is the real energy generating guts of the engine. And then with time, as people wanted to build bigger aircraft, needed more thrust, they went, why am I keeping blacking out? All right. They went to high bypass. Now, in the modern high bypass engine, about 85% of the air goes around the core and about 15% goes through it. So only about 15% of the flow is being used by the turbo machinery to create the power to actually drive the engine. Now, over time, what's happened with engines? Well, Mr. Whittle, who's credited with having the first flying gas turbine engine, ended up with a little 1,200-pound thrust engine that weighed about 560 pounds. It consumed fuel so fast you could hear the sucking sound coming out of the tank. And it produced about 2 pounds of thrust for 2 pounds of weight. Now, over time, we got to the 60s, and the Pratt & Whitney JT8D was that engine that powered your 727, your 737, the DC-9. It was the engine out there in the air. If you flew, you were probably being propelled by a JT8D. Now, within 15 years or 10 years, you had the first of the high bypass engines flying. And now you had your 747, you went on to the 57, the 67, Airbus came along with the A300, and these engines were producing 5-6 pounds of thrust per pound of engine. Then you get up to the biggest engines of today, you're up into the GE90 and similar engines. These engines are 10, 11 feet in diameter. And I'm talking about the fan diameter, not that outer cowling. When you get to the outer cowling, it's more like 15. But you're talking about an engine that is so big. When I stand in the inlet, and my feet are down here in the inlet, the spinner is right here in my eyes. These engines are huge. Now, how does the engine work? Well, that's kind of a mystery to a lot of people. They see it, it looks like a giant Cuisinart, and they think, okay, we feed in the various fruit, we catch it at the end, and we make a margarita, right? Well, it doesn't quite work that easily. But the air is drawn into the engine. A certain portion of it goes down into the core. Now, by the core, I'm talking about a series of compressors that compress the air. When Mr. Whittle built his engine, he was compressing the air about 3 or 4 times, then adding fuel, and the fuel was then burned, and it expanded and created the expanding air to move the turbine. Today's engines, you're compressing the air 50, 60, 70 times. So the pressures in the back of these engines, when you get down to the combustor, are in the neighborhood of 700, 800, 900 PSI minimum. They're higher than that during the most extreme conditions. You add in the fuel, and now because you've got this really concentrated amount of oxygen with that highly compressed air, you get a lot of fuel in. So you get a flame prod starting in the combustor. It's in the neighborhood of 3,000 degrees. So you think about the materials we've got in the turbine, they all melt at that temperature. So the mystique that goes on in the engine today is that all of this back end of the engine uses air that comes out of the compressor to flow through those parts, and they're internally cooled with air that's stolen from the compressor. So it's a very careful balancing act that makes these engines work. Then you end up with the 15% of the thrust coming out of the core with that hot exhaust, and the other 85 being the cold flow going through the bypass. Now, when you land, you want to have some additional braking. It's nice to have brakes on the wheels, but what if it's icy? What if it's raining? You can use reverse thrust. And so what you've got is a sliding door in the cowl with a series of cascade vanes. When they open that door and throw the blocker up into the secondary flow, it reverses the flow of the air coming off the fan, and you have reverse thrust. So when you're landing and you touch down, once the airplane is weight on wheels, you've got a switch that tells the airplane, hey, I'm on the ground, I'm really here. And at that point, the pilot can engage thrust reverse. And that's when you're sitting there by the wing and you see the airplane just shaking like crazy for a minute as it goes into reverse thrust. And you slow the airplane down quite a bit using reverse thrust. I don't know why the mouse is being so sensitive today. So one of the questions that comes up, is the engine there for propulsion or other things? Well, in the days of the Wright brothers, it was propulsion. They had no movies, they had no coffee maker, they had no fancy lights, they had no fancy cockpit displays. So it was strictly propulsion. Today, that engine supplies a lot of power. It's got electric power because you've got your in-seat audio, video, you plug in your charger for your phone or your iPod or whatever. You've got hydraulics. The control surfaces on the airplane are very large, and so you have hydraulics to help move those. And then pneumatics. You want to pressurize the cabin. And you also want to drive de-icing air for the inlet on the engine. So you end up using an awful lot of other power from the engine for other things than just producing thrust. Now you look out the window, you see that engine on your airplane. It usually looks in proportion to the airplane, you think nothing of it. But in reality, you look at somebody's little biz jet, that little engine's only about yay big around. You move up into your commuter type regional jets. These engines in the neighborhood of 3 feet, maybe 4 feet. They're a good bit bigger, but not that big. Then you get up into your large transports, the narrow bodies, the single aisle aircraft. Those are in that neighborhood of 5 to 6 feet in diameter. And then you get up into the big boys, the A380s, the 747s, the 777s. The engines in that range are all up in the 7 to 11 foot diameter range. So they're huge. So when we think about ingesting things into an engine, in the days of the 707, 727, 737, a big bird was about all you could get into the engine. Well, today you could fly an MD-80 into the inlet of a GE90 115B. They're that big. Now, the other thing most people don't realize is just how many airplanes are out there in the air. In the US alone, there's something over 4,000 aircraft registered and flying on any given day. What this amounts to is there's about 19 million flight hours each year. And that's about 9.5 million flights per year of just domestic US carriers here in the US. So that equates to about 26,000 flights a day. So when you look up in the air, you see a contrail go by, or you see the airplane coming in, and you're going, oh, he's heading for Charlottesville. He's one of 26,000 out there. Now you start to think globally. You take something like just the 7.3 or the CFM56 powered fleet, which is 737 and A320s. There's one of those taking off somewhere in the world every 3 seconds. Aviation is huge and it runs 24/7. And what's fascinating is the flights are on time more than 90% of the time. Now you take the 10% that they aren't, there's a huge part of it that's weather. There's a huge part of it that is, oh, the food truck was late and the passengers were revolting because they didn't get their margarita before they took off. You get down to how many of those are engine problems. It's very, very few. So when you think about time on wing, you don't make money with your airplane if it's not flying. Well, what's the biggest thing to take off the airplane and put it back on? Well, it's an engine. You go back to the 60s, it took 3, maybe 4 days sometimes to swap engines on an airplane. By the 80s, one of the big challenges was, how do you swap the engine out in no more than 1 day? It's a big job. You've got a lot of connections. It's a big, heavy piece of material, and it's got to be put on correctly. The other side of the equation was, how long can you keep the engine on wing? You don't have to take it off. Well, you don't have a schedule problem. So you look back at the 60s, the hard time older engines were having to come off wing about every 1,500 hours. Well, they didn't fly as much then as we do today, but that still meant you were only getting maybe a year on wing for an engine. Today, the engines are flying 18, 20, 22,000 hours between overhauls. So it's about 6 years. So it means that you're not taking the engine off very often, but that means you've got to have extremely reliable engines in order to do that. And so how do we get there? Well, it's not cheap. An engine today costs between 10 and 40 million, depending upon how big the engine is. And it costs about 3 to 12 million to overhaul it. So when you think about buying your commercial airplane, you're putting about 20, 25% of the cost into engines. And then one of your biggest maintenance costs is the cost of the engine. So to make it profitable, that engine has to keep running. You can't make money if the shop foreman is telling you, I'm sorry, it's down, we're waiting for parts, and the parts are in the Suez Canal because of COVID, and it'll be a week before we get it. That's not an acceptable answer. So the key is to keep the engine on wing and keep it flying and keep it reliable. And what that means is today's engine, it typically has 1 in-flight shutdown per million flight hours. So you think about a cockpit crew, it's got 2 people in it. They don't fly that many hours a year, and they fly maybe 30 years. What it means is only about every other crew will have 1 member who's had an in-flight shutdown during his entire career as a commercial pilot. Now, when he flew military before coming into the commercial service, yeah, he had a few. They did different things. Now you think about the engines and people talk about government regulations, what a pain in the neck it is and how it delays everything. Well, it also levels the playing field. When I was in industry, one of the things we looked at with regulations was it meant everybody had a standard of safety they had to meet. And it was not argued. If we didn't have those standards, people could go, what are the odds of hitting a bird? What are the odds of flying into bad weather? Well, I don't need an engine that's good enough to do that because I'm going to avoid it. Well, by making it mandatory that you be able to handle a lot of these capabilities, it means everybody has the same level of safety when they get on an airplane. And so when you think about the kinds of things that we certify an engine to do, it's got to have adequate fatigue capability. You've got to have instructions for continued airworthiness. Well, how many of us have instructions for auto worthiness with our cars that we actually follow? Most of us go, yeah, I've had a vibration like that before, or, oh, yeah, I've had that squeak before, or I've had. Well, in the airline industry, when you see certain things happen, you've got a list of mandatory actions that must be taken. So part of engine certification is you develop what are the actions for the types of problems that occur. And these become the instructions for continued airworthiness. That's all part of certification. Durability and endurance. It's one thing to have an engine that can demonstrate a capability it's on the test stand before it's delivered. If that engine has to stay on the wing for 20,000 hours, it's got to have that capability 20,000 hours later. It may burn more fuel at that time, but it's got to have the capability. So it's got to be able to meet thrust. It's got to be operable. You can't say, oh, this engine's halfway to overhaul, so maybe I'll only get halfway across the Atlantic. Well, you might think, okay, I can get halfway to the grandkids this weekend. I'll stop, I'll pick up a rental car, and then I'll finish the trip. But with an airplane, we don't really accept that. You start to look at rain and hail ingestion. Well, Mother Nature happens. We can't control Mother Nature, and those who try to usually lose. So part of the testing that we go through involves all kinds of crazy things. Like this test right here is the water ingestion test. If you're going to fly into a typhoon, you're going to have an incredible volume of water that comes into that engine. And as you can see in that case, the jets are producing a lot of water into that engine, and you see it coming out the exhaust of the engine as liquid, because most of it's going through the bypass duct. But the part that gets into the core, if the core has not been designed to accommodate that amount of water, it'll put the engine out. That's not a good day. I guess one of the infamous cases there was Taka Airlines was coming into New Orleans, and they flew into a freak weather occurrence that swamped out the engines. The pilot was a former military pilot, and he happened to look down, saw a break in the clouds, he saw a levee. And we all know New Orleans. You think New Orleans, you think levees. There was a levee just big enough, he put the 37 on the ground on the levee and had a successful landing. We don't want to see that done again. So that engine got some redesigns to it to make it more accommodating for that kind of extreme weather event. Other issues that we deal with are ice. When you think about ice, you think about flying through snow. Well, ice can accumulate on stators, vanes, can create problems within the engine, but you can also build up ice on the inlet and have a slab break free. So we de-ice the inlet to minimize the amount of ice that can occur there. And then the amount that can, we have to demonstrate can be ingested by the fan and not destroy the fan. Now, one of the other exciting tests down here, a couple of these are a little fancier. This one right here is a bird test. So they're firing birds into the engine. And as the bird gets into the, certain birds have to be targeted for the core. Most birds are going to hit the fan, go out the bypass duct. But in certifying, you're going to say it's possible to have a bird enter the core. So in this test, you force birds to hit within the core. Those then create a disruption of airflow in the engine. You get a surge, you get a stall, you get that neat flame that comes out the engine. Then the engine has to recover and continue to run. It can't just flame out and say, I hit a bird, I'm done. Now, you do have the extremes like the Miracle on the Hudson. You put enough birds that are big enough in the engine that are way beyond the cert basis, and you're going to lose the engine. And that happened there. The real key there is that they do more and more every year to try to figure out where are the bird populations. Let's not put wildlife refuges at the end of the runway. Whoops, they had that in New York. Let's not put trash dumps at the end of the runway. Oh, New Delhi. Quite a few airplanes there had problems taking off, and the gulls spooked and flew up into the engines. And the pilot nightmare, oops, didn't behind here, this picture over here, they have a whole flock of birds sitting. The British Airways A320 is flying through. That's what a pilot really doesn't want to see. It does occur. And then the last test down here, this is a fan blade out. Fan blades are actually blades in general are designed not to break. The fan blade is the most energetic of the blades, so it's the one that's tested most severely. But the goal here is if you have a failure of a blade, you don't want it to exit the case and risk damage to the airframe. So one of the most brilliant tests that occurs is the one with the fan blade out. You get lots of smoke, lots of fire, lots of exciting noise, and makes for an exciting day when you go to watch one. And with that, questions?
Why do we fly?
Because it's quicker than walking. It allows you to get fresh fish, middle of the desert. It just came out of the ocean. It's amazing because one of the things that happened, fish is kind of a joke because as flying became more popular, one of the things they realized is they had open cargo space. Someone realized that salmon are coming out in Alaska during fish season. We got tuna coming up in Florida, wherever. People in Kansas would love to have this. And so you can get fresh fish anywhere in the country. And it's all because there's extra cargo space that they can pack fish into and ship on ice and have available for your dinner when you want it. He's always got loaded questions, so you gotta watch out.
How about that? You saying that to service an engine, you have to take it off the wing?
Well, to overhaul the engine,
Okay,
to check the oil, to do things like that, no, that's all done on wing.
but that's a major job, is to take that thing off the wing.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
How long does it take now to take one off?
It depends on the engine. If you've got something like a 737, most of those can be done in about a shift and a half, as opposed to 4, 5, or 6. When you get up to a big GE90 on a 777, you're talking 3 shifts or so.
They're still within a day?
Oh, yeah. Mhm. Now, getting that replacement GE90 to Podunk Airport is kind of tricky.
What's the latest on the Boeings that were having problems?
Excellent. Helen had her hand up first
Oh,
there.
sorry. The bird ingestion test, please tell me they don't use real birds for that.
They are frozen birds that are then thawed. They,
It's a lot of birds.
yes. Yes.
You see you walking down the street with a flag and a sign, save the birds, you're not letting her on an airplane, right?
But when you think about the test, you've got 1 large bird, you've got 3 medium birds, and you've got 12 small birds. So it's not a lot of birds to certify an engine. And that engine program is certified once. So you're not talking about a lot of birds participating. Now, for the last 20 years, there have been a couple of NASA projects trying to come up with the hybrid bird. So they can use a synthetic bird, but they have yet to find one that replicates the kind of damage that occurs with a real bird. So we still use real birds. The mistake you make is if you don't call the bird, especially when they test windscreens on airframes. Well, it goes right through.
What's the latest on the Boeings that were having problems?
Software issue.
I'm an engine person, not an airframe person. So I can't really speak to that.
Good luck.
So, does it matter where you put the engine on the airplane?
Yes, it does. And the airframers have a lot of desirable spots they'd like to put it. When you think about that jet picture I had at the beginning, the centerline mounted engine is the optimum place. But most passengers would object to having a great big engine in the middle of the passenger bay of the airplane. So they've got to go outside. As you move the engines outside the fuselage, you're now starting to put a moment on the airplane. So you've got to have more rudder. You put more rudder up there, you got more drag. So it's one of these dog chasing its tail problems. So you look at the airplanes of yesteryear, the engines were out of ways. You look today at the twins, the engines are tucked down very close to the center line. And that's to minimize that moment on the airplane and to keep the tail size under control. Because the tail size has got to be designed to accommodate one engine out at takeoff when you've got the most thrust.
Fuel efficiency, you may have addressed this and I wasn't translating it, but how has that improved over the past decades? And
Well,
where do you see it going?
as airframe drag has gone up, as they built bigger and bigger airplanes, engine efficiency has driven fuel consumption down. So the improvement in efficiency of today's aircraft over 1960s and such is primarily the engines.
So, Chip, question that's we're dealing with in the Center of Sustainable Aviation Fuel. I mean, that's still kerosene, right? I mean, so at the end of it, they're talking about blended fuels, you know, with fossil as well as biomass based. Just from a chemistry perspective, I guess the molecular molecules are exactly the same when they blend those, and there's no impact on the engine.
Ooh, that's a good misconception. I'm not a fuels guy, but one of the guys I worked with was, and the part of the fuels that I was interested in is as a mechanical guy. I dealt with some of the mechanical problems in fuel controls.
Right.
When you look at fuel, it's made up of long chain molecules and short chain molecules. The short chain molecules are your high volatile, your long chain are low volatility. Now, lubricity, it's the long chain that you want for lubricity. So if you look at fuel and you let it age, the short chain volatiles evaporate off. You're left with the long chain. They don't burn as readily, so you've got to worry about the engine flaming out if you just stuck with those. When they look at making fuel, they're mixing these different cuts that come out of the fuel generation. And so depending upon whether you're using recycled dinosaurs or recycled sugarcane, you're going to have a different mix of long and short, and it will.
So it is an issue.
It is an issue. No, you got a whole bunch of things on the agenda there, and
The airline only worked at 99% efficiency. 99% efficiency. Every day, 5 airplanes would land at the wrong airport.
yeah.
If we only worked at 99% efficiency, every day, 5 airplanes, 5 commercial flights would land at the wrong airport.
And when you think about the reliability of engines, of major airplane systems and such, one of the behind the scenes discussions that takes place quite a bit is what is our rate of failure? And when you look at rate of failure, you then look at what's the projected number of flights that we want to see in 5 years, 10 years. And then you stop and say, if we continue with our current failure rate, what's the associated accident rate? We want to keep that rate. We want to keep that at the same number of headline events per year or less than what we have today. So what that means is the reliability has to continue going up as the number of flights goes up. And so one of the first things I ran into when I went to work in industry was, how do we improve engine reliability so that we make sure we don't see event X or event Y occurring more than once every 2, 3, 5 years. And it meant we had to reduce the level of failure by an order of magnitude, and then another order of magnitude. So right now, engine failure rates are 2 orders of magnitude better than when I started in industry. No, it's a huge group of people that work together. we all work hard at it. Yep.
I'd like to introduce a couple of guests real quick, John Rett.
Oh.
Steve Wagner. Always welcome. Which you realize, turn you upside down and bring all your money. Thanks very much. Now, the next item of business is a newcomer to this club. Most of you I know have received my copy of the email that we got from Pat Borowski, Mr. Governor. I forwarded on to you about the tragedy in the Ukraine and the plan the Rotary has to raise bucketloads of money to take care of that. Now, Rotary has based its tradition on